It's great to be here today on Daily Impact, and we have a very wonderful study, great topic to get into when we open the Bible. But before we do, you've got something for us.
The logo game. The logo game. So you're going to see a logo, they're going to see a logo, see if you can beat them to the punch.
I'm a little nervous about this.
You know, I've heard that there are people who are playing these games with us, and that they beat us every time. That's what they say to me. We beat you every time. And I don't believe that.
I don't believe
I'm trying to think of who said that.
I don't know
Teenagers, we beat you every time.
that
don't believe
that
it.
one memory game. They may have gotten Buzz Lightyear before us.
I doubt that.
It took us about a day and a half.
Maybe the memory game.
Maybe
Yeah, not our best game. Maybe logo will be better.
So here we go, the logo game. I'm going to show them a logo. Then some of these are going to be real quick. So you can see if you beat them, but some of these are easy, some of them a little more difficult.
Okay.
I showed the first one already, full disclosure.
Lowe's.
Okay, so we can... so we can get past that. You guys both jumped on that one. You want that first point. Okay, here we go. So starting off, we'll give that to him 1-1. 1-1. So here we go. Going 3, 2.
Athlete's foot.
Foot Locker.
Athlete's foot. Now it has a brand. I missed that.
That is some expensive athlete's foot right there.
I need part of that of that point.
No.
Yes, foot right. Yes, foot right.
Sorry.
Alright, brother, you do it 2. 2 to 1.
Two.
Here we go.
It's 2-1.
2-1.
2-1.
You guys both got
We
lows.
both got lows.
Oh, okay.
I got
That's fine.
Don't hurt
That's
yourself.
not.
Good
I think I pulled a hamstring.
2 to 1. Here we go. 3, 2.
Oh boy. I know
At
this.
home they beat you. At home they beat it. They got you.
I'll be honest with you. I have no idea. I have never seen that logo before.
There's an app called Todoist, but that's not it. But it's very close.
It is red and white.
Is it?
And isn't that one like to do is spelled really weird, like TEAUX or something?
T.
To do.
No.
Okay.
TODO. What is it? I don't know what it is.
You want me to give you a
Staples?
hint? No, I'll give you a hint. It's not south.
North Star. North Face.
North Face.
Athlete's foot.
North Face. It's a North Face.
Yeah,
logo.
I knew that
I
right
thought
off.
you
As soon as
guys
I
would get
saw it. I was
Alright, here we
thinking
go.
North Face.
That was on
2
the
to
tip
2.
of my tongue.
Was it really?
No, and
2 to 2.
if you're a
3,
teenager out there and you did not get that
2.
before us, you're hurting.
1.
Is that Tommy Hilfiger?
Tommy Hilfiger,
Oh,
Brother
yeah.
Judah with the clothing brand.
Oh no. Thank you,
I
sir.
actually knew that. It was not coming out. No.
3 to 2. 3 to 2. Starting now, they both, whether they realize it or not, they both are very familiar with this brand, and probably more familiar with this brand than anyone watching. So I'm leading you up, setting you up for this one. Here we go. So 3, 2.
ESPN.
ESPN.
Yeah.
Wow, that was good. I thought it would
Yeah.
take you guys a little bit longer.
Yes.
I didn't get that one at first. To be honest, just that top line. That was good. That was good. 4 to 2. 4 to 2. All right.
I was
here we
looking
go.
for a win today too. This is hurting my self-esteem.
4 to 2. 3, 2.
Burger King.
I got it.
I think you got it.
5 to 2. Brother Judah taking that.
Man, you know your logo.
I know my logos. Yeah.
That's good.
I give it to you.
That's awesome. Do we need to keep going? I got
I can
several
go on
more.
that.
Here we
Just
go.
get one more.
Let's
Just let me
go.
see if we can end on a win.
All right. Here we go. Going in 3, 2.
Holiday Inn.
Oh, I'm giving that one a tie. Let's go one more. Just because I like this one. I don't know. What, do you think you won that one?
No.
No, I think it was
Okay.
a tie. I
Okay.
do think it
Okay.
was a tie.
Here we go. 3, 2.
You can say that when you're winning 5-2. Oh, leaf. Leaf. Orange leaf.
It has
Tea leaf.
No.
What is it?
No.
Orange
No.
Julius.
No,
No,
Julius.
no,
That's
no.
a good guess though.
Smoothie King.
No.
Oh, that was a good
nothing
guess.
to do with a smoothie.
It's orange.
It is.
Orange
That is orange.
tea. Orange tea leaf. Orange brand.
It is a brand of a drink
Yeah, I know.
that starts with an
Minute Maid.
F-A.
Fanta.
Fanta.
Really?
That's a Fanta.
That's actually
Logo.
funny. That is actually
There you go.
funny.
There you go.
There's a story behind that. That's funny. Okay.
You know
I
that
don't
one?
know what that is.
What?
This is the car brand. A lesser known car brand.
I would
Apparently,
say.
lesser.
I would say.
Sorry.
Oh, wow.
Is
I don't-
that Volvo?
That's their logo.
Sure is.
Mhm.
Huh.
Alright, this one's for Brother Judy, 'cause this is a classic.
Sega.
Sega. Good stuff. Alright, we got more, but
No.
we can end there today if we need to. Pick this one up another time. Alright, one more.
Okay.
You know that one?
Man.
This is a tough one.
American Express.
American Express.
All right. Yeah.
Shining
Oh.
bright.
Hey,
All right.
That's impressive.
Those of you at home, make sure he's not looking at it.
I am not looking at a screen. I was
Oh,
not.
That's funny.
I was not.
That was good. That was good.
Wow, that wasn't good. That wasn't good at all.
Sorry.
All right.
Ephesians 6. I don't know how to segue into that, but Ephesians chapter 6. You know, young people, we really do have a good conversation going here about spiritual warfare, and the armor of God is what we're talking about. And the Bible says in Ephesians chapter 6, verse number 10, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. I was thinking about this today as we were talking. All of us have had those moments where we're afraid of the boogeyman in the dark. You know, some invisible enemy that is built up and hyped up, and you know, we realize he doesn't even exist. You know, hopefully we've grown out of that. But the Bible paints a picture here in Ephesians chapter 6 that frankly is scary. You know, it talks about an invisible enemy. It talks about plans that have been laid for me, for you, for you. Talks about powers that are outside of our control, things that we're not familiar with. But what I like about it is that the Bible gives us, it doesn't paint that picture so that we can be afraid. It gives us a path to victory. So as we talk about spiritual warfare, we talk about the enemy and the armor and all of it. Keep this in mind. It's so that we can be victorious, so that we can win. And we see in verse number 10, the command to be strong. Verse number 11, put on the whole armor of God. And what I see there is that God has given us armor piece by piece, and we need all of it. Put on the whole armor of God. You know, it's not enough to just put on the helmet of salvation and have that, but everything else is left unprotected. That's not, you'll lose that way. You know, we were talking earlier about going into battle, and you're going into battle and you have a helmet on and you have, you know, your feet are taken care of, but there's no breastplate of righteousness. You're vulnerable.
Right.
And so put on the whole armor of God every day, deliberately, on purpose, piece by piece, putting on the entire armor of God that we might be able to stand, the Bible says, against the wiles of the devil. And verse 12, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. And I see that.
Right, and you know, when you get to verse 12, I'm just reminded the context of this passage is right in between a bunch of relationships. You know, we have the end of chapter 5 is really the thesis in the Bible of husbands and wives and how we should love and get along with one another. And then the start in chapter 6, children obey your parents. Then it talks about fathers provoking not your children to wrath in verse 4. And then servants and masters are talked about next. And it has a lot to do with how we work together with one another in our relationships of life. And then it comes to that verse 12 and it says, just a reminder, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So in context here, and I know we started on verse 10, but of course the Bible doesn't start in verse 10. The Bible's talking about relationships all through here, and it goes back to that thought briefly when it says, just remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So if you're thinking as we talk, yeah, you know, I struggle with my relationship with my parents. Can I remind you, you don't struggle with flesh and blood. That problem is not with your mom and dad. It is a spiritual problem. You know, I think of sometimes people struggling with the boss at work or this coworker. Again, the struggle is not with that coworker. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. It just talks through those relationships, and it's talking about if you want to even be strong in those relationships, you're going to have to put on the whole armor of God. And let me just finish by saying this. Brother Hiles used to say, life is a series of relationships, and your success in life will be determined by your success in those relationships. How many people we point to as very successful people, but they don't feel successful because you know what, they failed in their marriage, or they failed with their kids, and they weren't successful in those relationships, and they feel like a failure in life. A reminder, the devil's after your relationships, and understand in those relationships, you need the armor of God in order to be successful.
Yeah, verse 12, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And Brother Judah, you mentioned the boogeyman earlier, and sometimes I feel like in the Christian life, you know, we go through life and it's just like the boogeyman. Like it's just it's just a made up idea of someone who's just gonna jump out and scare us. Like the devil, these principalities and powers, they're not really real. You know, we can kind of trick ourselves into thinking we're not really in a fight. But a question that I ask myself as I'm reading this passage is that, man, I have faith in God. I believe in God. I work to get to know God, man, with strong conviction. I hold to the truths of this book. What also is in this book, it says that there are principalities and powers that we are in a fight against. It's not a boogeyman. It's not someone that's in our closet. We are in a battle, and man, Paul says it's not a suggestion. He says in verse 11, put on. Like, hey, these are things, you gotta have them. You need to put these things on because you are in a fight. You are in a battle, and we need to realize that as Christians. And going back to that word power, these are principalities and against powers. You don't just kind of wake up one day and have power, right? Or we were talking about warriors the other day. These warriors were men of power. Why? Because, man, they have this track record of victories, of wins.
There you go.
And in the Christian life, we aren't against.
That's what we're up against.
Yeah, a formidable opponent.
We're up against victorious enemies. We're up against forces that are not used to losing. God's promised us the victory. How often are we victorious? I mean, that's the thing. That's why we need to be deliberate. You know, I got thinking as you were talking about the flesh and blood relationships, I just got thinking, I kind of got lost there for a minute, thinking about the depth that Satan will go to really fight this fight. You know, he will get us to believe for the entirety of our lives that our problem is with flesh and blood. You really see the deceitfulness. You really see how well he plays this game. You know, I've worked with young people, and you've worked with adults. I've worked with adults, but in church work, Christian work, I'd say most people think their problem is with another person. You know, most young people, we use that word rebellious. You know, what are we rebellious against? You know, normally somebody in their authority or some home rule or some school, and it's just a straw man that the devil has set up to get us to fight that fight and not this fight. And we've lost before we even realize it. I think that's why he leads with, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I mean, the first lie that we need to tear down is that our fight is somehow with each other, some establishment. It is an unseen fight, you know, against powers and against the rulers of the darkness of this world. This morning we were talking about this. I got hung up on that phrase, the rulers of the darkness of this world. I think about darkness. I think of people that are blinded, people that are deceived. You think about the false religions of the world. You think about the zeal of the Mormons, you know, the dedication of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the commitment of Islam, the false ideologies of, you know, different world systems that people buy into. And you ask yourself, why is it that people by the millions are doing this stuff, this crazy stuff? Why? It's not just a clever guy who thought something up. You know, it's really, there's more to it than that. It's the rulers, the darkness of this world. And that's our fight. And but God gives us a path to victory, and that path to victory is going to be found in the next few verses, in the next few daily impacts. We love you, young people. God bless you.